Welcome to the VBA presentation for Performance Solutions. I'm Andrew Cellini, State Building Surveyor with the Victorian Building Authority. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd just like to quickly introduce our Building Surveyors webinar series. This is the first for this year, and we're looking at running a number of others during the year. This particular one's on performance solutions, and we're hoping you'll find it useful. You've all joined this webinar on listen-only mode. At the end, we'll give you an opportunity for questions and answers. You can provide those questions via the chat window. And the presentation itself will run for about 45 minutes, with about 15 minutes at the end to run through some of those questions and answers. I'd like now to introduce Matt Waters, Team Leader of Building Audit at the VBA, to do the presentation, and look forward to joining you again at the end of the presentation.
Hi everyone. So today's seminar is broken up into three distinct parts. So part one, we're going to deal with the fundamentals of performance solutions. We're going to go looking at the background and the key concepts that underpin performance-based legislation and specifically performance solutions. Part two will cover the responsibilities of building surveyors in the performance solution process. So we're going to be looking at the building surveyors' involvement in performance solutions and how they must make determinations and document those. Part three, we'll look at the audit findings and concerns. So we'll be going through a few case studies of what we're seeing and finding. And we're going to be providing some examples of some poorly justified performance solutions and really analyse what could have been done better in those circumstances. And then look at the use of code mark certificates as evidence of suitability as an assessment method, and really analysing the responsibilities of a building surveyor in terms of accepting code mark certificates. So that's the outline of the day. We'll move into part one, which is the fundamentals of performance solutions. So the first part I really want to talk about is, when it comes to performance solutions, is the concept of risk assessment and risk management, and really look at how it differs between performance solutions and deemed to satisfy solutions. So it's important to understand that the structure and processes that are required to manage performance can differ from those that are typically utilised to manage deemed to satisfy solutions. And if we look at DTS solutions and provisions, it's essentially the codification of existing practices that were found to be acceptable over a historic time frame. So they're accepted by government, hence they're adopted via legislation, and they're given the deeming nature in the BCA, so they're deemed to satisfy the performance requirements. Really, as deficiencies or failures for improvements are identified, what happens is the DTS provisions incrementally shift to incorporate any necessary changes to achieve the desired objectives. So we can see examples of this in essentially every amendment to the BCA. And there's been some recent examples of some out of cycle amendments where the BCA was amended out of cycle to incrementally shift to incorporate some clarification. So an example of that is 2019 NCC Amendment 1. There's some clarification around timber frame concessions under Spec C 1.1. Now, if we look at this in contrast to performance solutions, in a performance solution process, it might be the first time that a design, material or form of construction has been trialled. So it's quite different in terms of the risk level. So I'm not saying that performance solution isn't legitimate, it obviously is. It's just that we need to understand how the risk changes and that the process and structure is different to that we typically need to manage a deemed to satisfy solution. If we consider the concept of risk a little further, it can be defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, if we consider the application of this concept to performance and DTS, we generally establish that there's a higher level of certainty with DTS provisions due to their deeming nature and the fact that we already know what the benchmark of compliance is. As we move to performance, the uncertainty rises, and therefore so does the risk level. So we really need to make sure that we manage the solution appropriately And that's where the assessment methods and the evidence and documentary decision-making comes into it. Now, this concept aligns with the proposed inclusion of a definition for building complexity into the NCC. And this considers things like the attributes that are complicated or organisational and might increase the likelihood of non-compliance. So it's a bit of an overview of just the underpinning risk assessment and management principles that would apply. We've got this flow chart on the screen that can be used to assist in determining if a building solution is either performance-based or deemed to satisfy. Now, it might seem a little basic. However, what we're finding from our audits suggests there's still a large amount of uncertainty and confusion as to when a performance solution might be required, and that there's some clarification. So if we go through this flow chart, essentially, we're first identifying if there's some deemed to satisfy provisions. If there are and it complies with that, it's a DTS solution. If there isn't, we're straight into performance. And if there are DTS provisions and it's not complying with those, for instance, it might be out of scope of a DTS provision, then we're back into the performance solution territory. In a volume 2 context, we're simply looking for an acceptable construction practice or manual and compliance in accordance with that. Now, there's some really unique situations in the NCC. It happens in both volumes where there are no deemed to satisfy requirements to satisfy a performance requirement. So in these circumstances, a performance solution is always required to demonstrate compliance with the performance requirement. So we're going to discuss that briefly now and go through what's expected. So FP 1.4 is a performance requirement that deals with weatherproofing of a roof and external wall. Most people would probably be aware that in volume 1, there's no deemed to satisfy provisions to satisfy this performance requirement. So I like to personally refer to these situations as an automatic performance solution because it's the only compliance option that the code's giving you. So you don't have that DTS pathway. Now, if we have a look at the limitations in FP 1.4, there's some limitations for a class 7 and 8 building. However, there's some judgment required in terms of whether there's a necessity to comply or not. So if we had a class 7 or 8 building, there might be circumstances where compliance is required, and it might be due to the use of the building, the nature of what's being stored, or activities that are undertaken in the building. So this is not an automatic exemption. We'd need to consider it in a case-by-case basis. So if we thought about a situation where this might not apply, it would probably be a situation like a car park, for instance, as it would really be unreasonable to require compliance with this specific performance requirement. In the audits the VBA is undertaken into building permits, we very rarely see performance solutions that are documented for weatherproofing and FP 1.4 compliance. The only situations we've come across documented solutions is typically via the use of code mark certificates. However, these often lack in holistic consideration to the performance requirements, so all relevant performance requirements. There's also some unique situations in volume 2 where the same thing occurs. And this deals with things like drainage for swimming pools and bushfire shelters, so class 10C buildings, which we'll touch on a little bit later in terms of the building surveyor's responsibility in documenting those. I'm going to go relatively quickly through this because I'm sure everyone's aware. But I'm just going to look at section A as it relates to performance solutions. Now, we would all know that we comply with the NCC by complying with the performance requirements and the governing requirements. So they're the mandatory compliance pathway under the code. In terms of a performance solution, there's 2 ways that that can be achieved. And it's either via a first principle approach, which is a direct assessment against the performance requirements. So it's an absolute type assessment, or there's a benchmark approach, which is where the solution is assessed against the DTS provisions for equivalence. Now, what the benchmark approach is identifying is really the deeming nature of the DTS provisions and how they're accepted as meeting the performance requirements. In terms of the pathway chosen, it's largely going to relate to the complexity of the solution, highly likely whether there are deemed to satisfy provisions or not, the stringency of the DTS provisions, and then the nature of the performance requirements. So, for example, if they're written in qualitative or quantitative terms. And we're really going to look at the difference now and analyse some of the performance requirements. so we can understand how they're written. So we have two performance requirements shown on screen. We've got Vic FP 3.1, which deals with habitable room or space sizes. And then we've got FP 1.2, which is for prevention of rainwater from entering a building. Now, if we read FP 3.1, we can see that it's written in qualitative terms, as there's no minimum size provided for the room for the performance requirement. So you can see that it uses the word must in regard to it being a sufficient size to fulfill its intended function. And this is really the condition that must be met by any performance solution. It clearly allows for some flexibility in terms of the size of the room or space. And then in contrast, when we read FP 1.2, we can see that it's written in quantitative terms, as it's providing this absolute measure in terms of the average recurrence interval. So the performance requirement's clearly providing this measure that we must comply with. And there's obviously the same flexibility in terms of the compliance solution. It's just this condition, which is the average recurrence interval of the storm event, has been quantified. So any performance solution that we justify or design must incorporate that, and it must pass that aspect. So that's an overview of the quantitative and qualitative nature. Now we're going to delve into some more of the language the NCC uses for performance, and there's some key expressions used. And these are to the degree necessary and appropriate to. They're underlined in red on the slides. And what these are doing is they're providing flexibility to the appropriate authority to allow them to determine the degree of compliance that's necessary in a specific case. Now, what this is recognising is that performance requirements may not have universal application. And this is a concept called case and condition appropriate to drafting. So what it does is it limits the operation of the performance requirement, where the case identifies the circumstances the performance requirement's triggered, and then the condition identifies the requirements that we must meet. So I've got this example on the screen of EP 1.4. Now this deals with automatic fire suppression, and we've used it because it contains both of the expressions. So it's really interesting to read it in the context. So we're going to break it down and analyse what these expressions mean in the context of the performance requirement. And we'll see that firstly, an automatic fire suppression system must be installed to the degree necessary. And what this simply means is you do not need to install the system if you can demonstrate one's not required. And this is the case statement of the performance requirement. The next part is that it says you need to control the development and spread of fire. And this is explaining why a system is required to be installed. And then if we look at this further, if the same result can be achieved by a performance solution, there's no need to install a fire suppression system. We then get to appropriate to, which lists 4 different matters that needs to be considered in our development of any performance solution. And this is called the condition statement. And these criteria are set to acknowledge situational nature and how the outcome can be significantly altered by physical characteristics and attributes of the building. So we can see that in A to B, they're all things that could dramatically dictate the extent that a system is required or not. So if we look at B, for instance, which is the functional use of the building, if we're looking at a building that had dangerous goods or storage of hazardous material, it would significantly change our approach to any documented performance solution. So by breaking down the wording, we found out a significant amount of information about what must be taken into consideration in the development of any performance solution. So when meeting this performance requirement, we really need to step it out and ensure that any fire engineering report that's addressing this would cover off on all those different situations. Now, performance solutions must be assessed in accordance with one or more of the 4 assessment methods that the BCA lists. And they're either evidence of suitability, a verification method, expert judgment, or a comparison with deemed to satisfy. Now, we're not going to go into depth of them, but we're going to focus on the use of a verification method. And in this instance, it's CV3, which is relatively new, and it's used to verify compliance with CP2 to avoid the spread of fire via an external wall. Now, most people would probably be aware that there's a standard AS5113, which is the full-scale test standard, and it sets out the procedures for testing and classifying external walls according to their ability to limit spread of fire across their surface. If using CV3, and this goes for most verification methods, passing one specific aspect isn't sufficient on its own. So in this context, passing AS5113 for EW classification isn't sufficient in its own right, and there are other provisions that need to be met. And the verification methods are very specific in how they outline this. So in this specific case, the verification method requires us to consider 3 different elements. The first one's fire spread. And what this requires is if we have another building on the same allotment or exposure to a fire source feature, we'd need to verify compliance with CV1 and CV2, which looks at radiant heat flux. The external wall system requirements is the testing using AS5113 and achieving our EW classification. And then we have some building requirements which depend on if the building's type A or B construction, and also the effective height of the building. So if we have a type A construction building, for instance, the building has to have a 2118 sprinkler system, and it must have protection to some areas that the verification method specifies. If the building's over 25 metres in effective height, there's also some other provisions that trigger, and that's around stop valves for the system and also some system flow requirements. Although a verification method is a performance solution, it can be looked at in relatively a similar nature than the deemed to satisfy, mainly because it's very prescriptive in terms of where it's verifying compliance with the performance requirements that it's identifying. So we've kind of outlined this because it's important to understand that a verification method is very specific, and any departure from a specific requirement in it would require detailed justification under a tailored performance solution. So we had some questions yesterday surrounding the use of FV1, which is a verification method that can be used to comply with FP 1.4 for external wall weatherproofing. And there's some potential situations where people ignore the risk score that needs to first be established. So it's important that if you're using a verification method as the means of compliance, you're going through everything. And if you're not, then you're documenting it as a specific performance solution. So just wanted to highlight that. For a period of time now, the Australian Building Codes Board have put out some guidance on the recommended process for the development of any performance solution, and they've got this 4-step process which they've pushed for several years now. In the preview version of the 2019 Amendment 1 NCC, it's proposed to mandate this process into Section A. So if you're using a performance solution, you must follow this 4-step process. Now, I need to note that the inclusion of this is subject to consideration by the board, and it's not yet been determined that this will come into the code, but it's certainly the process that the VBA recommends is undertaken for performance-based solutions. The first step in this process is that we document a performance-based design brief, which is done in consultation with all the relevant stakeholders. This is really the most critical part in the process, as it explains what's to be done, all the methods that will be used to assess the proposal, and then it goes through what outcomes are acceptable. So it's where we set our acceptance criteria. Now, when this is finalised, all the activities and outcomes would have been identified, and what it allows us to do is go through the design process with a high degree of confidence that if we meet the acceptance criteria in the brief, the proposed design is likely to be approved. So it gives that certainty around the design process, and it really documents the whole process in terms of how the performance solution is being justified. The second step is we carry out analysis, and that's using whatever assessment methods that have been proposed by the brief. And there are several ways of undertaking it, but generally they'll be discussed by the stakeholder group and then documented in the brief. The third step is where we carry out an evaluation of the results. So that's the analysis in step 2 is compared with the acceptance criteria we've established in step 1. And if it aligns, then the design should be approved. And if not, then further analysis would be needed. So we'd go back and repeat step 2, and then we'd possibly look at using different methods of analysis. In step 4, a final report is required to be produced, and there's some prescribed information that this must have in it. So it must include all the relevant performance requirements and deemed to satisfy provisions that were identified as being relevant. And then it goes through the assessment methods that have been used in the analysis. It gives us an overview of steps 1 to 3, so exactly what happened during the process, and then it needs to have confirmation that the performance requirement has been met. The last thing it also needs to have is any limitations of the performance solution. And this is really critical because it ensures that everyone involved understands any limitations, any maintenance obligations, and that's clearly articulated, and this can be given to the owners who are typically a stakeholder in the process. It is essentially very similar to the stepped out process in the International Fire Engineering Guideline. So it is relatively similar. It's just not specific to fire engineering. It is important that the brief, analysis, evaluation, and final report aren't undertaken by the building surveyor. This is supported by the VBA's proposed code of conduct, and we'll discuss this further in the seminar when we look at building surveyor responsibilities, where we really look at how far a building surveyor can be involved in the performance solution process. There's obviously a few different analysis approaches that can be used to analyse performance solutions. We've talked about comparative or absolute from satisfying a performance solution or documenting a performance solution. A comparative approach is just simply one where we're comparing against deemed to satisfy. An absolute is where we're doing an evaluation directly against the performance requirements and we're not doing a comparison with DTS. So quite often, if performance requirements are qualitative or it's difficult to quantify, the comparison with DTS option will be selected because it's a little bit more simpler to benchmark it. We've also talked about qualitative and quantitative approaches or methods of writing in terms of the performance requirements and how they're written. So qualitative is one that involves non-numerical and conceptual evaluation, and quantitative, we're looking at numerical evaluation. There's deterministic and probabilistic approaches as well, and deterministic is based on physical relationships, which is derived from scientific theories, and this will produce the same outcome, but it won't give you a probability of that outcome being realised. So a common example of that's used in fire engineering for travel distances, and that's something like ASET, RSET analysis. Probabilistic is a risk-based methodology, and it looks at assigning reliabilities to the performance of measures and then assigning frequencies of occurrence of different events occurring. So it looks at a number of event scenarios and then an estimate of the likelihood and consequences of the scenarios, and it looks at evaluating the risk. A common example of this is event tree type analysis, which is used in fire engineering for doing things like the design fires and things like probability of exceedance. So we're on to part 2, and we're going to just focus on the responsibilities of a building surveyor in performance solutions. So specifically what a building surveyor can and can't get involved with. There are 2 legal concepts that I want to start off by talking about, and this is called the burden of proof and the standard of proof. Now they're important as they directly relate to the way the building regulatory system operates, and very relevant to performance solutions in any type of assessment. Now in a case or a legal case we're talking about, one side has the burden of proof, meaning they have to prove their case, and then there's a concept, the standard of proof, which is the extent to which that side with the burden has to prove their case. So in a building surveying context, it's clearly not the building surveyor's responsibility to prove a proposal complies. That burden is on the person making the application or the claims of compliance to prove compliance is met. The regulatory framework supports this concept, as the RBS has a responsibility of assessing compliance and ultimately issuing a building permit only after they're satisfied that the building work and the building will comply with the Act and regulations. Obviously, the RBS needs to be able to document their decision making and explain how they satisfy themselves, but the burden lays with the applicant and people making claims of compliance. If we look at the standard of proof, now this is really looking at the documentation that has to be provided to the building surveyor for them to make the determination. And it needs to be sufficient for the RBS to be satisfied the building work will comply. Now in a building context, the standard of proof is provided for in the Act and Regulation. So we've got section 24(1)(a). And this is the part where an RBS can't issue the permit unless they're satisfied. Now that directly relates to the quality and level of documentation that they're provided with. We've also got regulation 24 and 25, and that prescribes that an application must have sufficient information to show the work will comply. So in that context, we're talking about that it will comply with the performance requirements. Now, every performance solution will require a different standard of proof as they're unique based on the situation that's present. It's also dependent on the building surveyor's risk tolerance and appetite, and things like the building surveyor's previous experience or exposure to certain situations will likely come into that decision-making process. Now, if we talk about an RBS's involvement in the design, we'd all know that a PBS is not permitted to carry out a function if they have a conflict of interest. So if themselves or someone they know, so a related person, prepare the design. There's a lot of debate around what specific advice a building surveyor can provide in terms of what constitutes design advice and how far you can go. Now, in terms of involvement in a performance solution, the building surveyor shouldn't be suggesting compliance solutions. However, it's important that they understand the pathway being considered and the acceptance criteria that's been developed as they're a key stakeholder. So in the performance-based design brief that we talked about, the building surveyor is a key stakeholder and they should be sitting at the table, although not suggesting compliance solutions. Now, to this effect, it's the view of the VBA that the building surveyor can provide commentary on whether they will accept the performance solution if the acceptance criteria that's been established by the stakeholders has been met. They shouldn't be suggesting the acceptance criteria or any specific design aspects, but you can give a yes, I'll accept the solution if it meets the acceptance criteria that the stakeholders have developed. There's some specific responsibilities and limitations placed on building surveyors when dealing with performance solutions. There's some really specific requirements for recording determinations that are made. So the building surveyor must record specific information, and it includes things like the performance requirements which are being complied with, details of the assessment methods, any expert judgment that's been used, and any other information that was relied upon in making the determination that a performance solution complied with the performance requirements. If expert judgment was relied upon, you need to record specific information, which is the extent to which you relied on the judgment, and then the qualifications and experience of the expert. So really that's documenting how you satisfied yourself that they were an expert for the purpose of expert judgment. Performance solutions must be listed on the building permit, the occupancy permit, and the CFI, whatever's relevant. Now, this includes code mark certificates. We had a lot of questions yesterday around if you still need to list a code mark certificate. It's only in situations where they're used as evidence of suitability for a performance solution. So if they're used for a deemed to satisfy solution, you don't list it. You'd only list it for a performance solution. So we had a lot of questions around code mark, and we go through some examples a little bit later, so we'll certainly touch on that. In terms of reliance on a Section 238 certificate, the building surveyor shouldn't be relying on the certificate in blind faith, and it's largely because the building surveyor has a duty of care to undertake proper inquiry and ensure the person providing the certificate is qualified and experienced and is acting within their competency. The building surveyor also needs to have regard to Ministerial Guideline 4, and that's where the complexity of the design might require another Section 238 certificate from someone other than that person who prepared the design of the performance solution. There's obviously the limitations with an RBS determining compliance with fire safety performance requirements, and then there's some with bushfire shelters. It either requires the building surveyor to hold certain qualifications or rely on a determination from the Building Appeals Board or certificates from others. Now, it's really important that everyone understands their legislative obligations when dealing in the performance solution space, just so you're meeting your obligations and ensuring that you're practicing appropriately. So we're on to part 3, which is audit findings and concerns. And in this part, we're going to go through some of our findings from some audits we've done. And show you what we're saying. So we have an example on the screen of some excerpts from a fire safety engineering report for a multi-storey mixed-use building, and it contained class 6 and 7A on the ground floor, and then it had 3 levels of class 2. It's obviously very common for fire safety engineering reports to contain limitations. And that's due largely to the fact that a fire safety engineer is typically only engaged to provide a solution for a specific component of a design. And it's normally a DTS non-compliance that's identified somewhere in the design. Now, what's important though is that the RBS has some understanding about the limitations and specifically how they could impact on holistic compliance. It's also extremely common in existing buildings where we see qualifications in reports that assumes compliance and that the existing building will fully comply with the BCA. This places a pretty unfair onus on the building surveyor. And in these circumstances, the building surveyor needs to consider all the assumptions and conditions and ensure that permit documentation is consistent. So in this fire engineering report, it contained these limitations that everything not considered in the FER was designed to comply with the DTS provisions, basically. They've identified some departures, which was clause C3.2, so protection of openings. So it had some openings in a wall that was required to have an FRL and it was unprotected. So it wasn't protected in accordance with clause C3.4. And then when we went to the specific wall that the openings were in, the plans show the wall as wall type S4, which we've shown on the screen. Now this wall required a fire resistance level of 90 minutes, so 90, 90, 90, under the DTS of spec C1.1. And obviously C3.2 only applies where a wall is required to have an FRL. So the performance solution considered the protection of openings and then assumes DTS compliance for fire resistance levels. The fire engineering report did deal with some reductions of FRLs in other aspects of the building on ground floor. However, it didn't reduce the FRLs or permit a lack of fire resistance levels for this specific wall. In terms of evidence that was in the section 30 documentation, there was no information to confirm the wall had an FRL using AS 1530 part 4. And this system certainly doesn't appear to be something that would achieve a 90-minute FRL. This is really something that we commonly see in audits where something very specific is identified and then a performance solution addresses it, but it fails to consider the wider holistic compliance and all relevant performance requirement. To this effect, the requirements of the BCA are built on redundancies, and many of the performance solutions we see remove these, and then they leave no protection in place if active system failure was to occur, or if there were poor construction practices on site. So it's really important to look at the BCA holistically and ensure that all relevant performance requirements are being satisfied. We discussed briefly the use of code mark as a term of, as a form of evidence of suitability, which is one of the assessment methods. So code mark certificates make very specific claims of compliance against specific parts of the BCA, and it's either deemed to satisfy performance requirements or both in some circumstances. They contain really specific limitations and conditions, and the reason they do is simply because the certification body was provided with evidence and they'll provide limitations so it aligns with what they received. Now we've got a code mark on screen and it's for a product and it makes really specific claims against some DTS provisions. It also has some really specific limitations, including the wall system as a whole is outside the scope, and it requires consideration by the building surveyor. We can see from the certificate there's no claims against Section B compliance for structural stability. There's no compliance claims for FP 1.4 for weatherproofing. And the Section B compliance would need to be done under a DTS or performance, but FP 1.4 is certainly a performance solution. Now, it's also important to consider things like CP1, which might be applicable, and it deals with structural stability during a fire. Now, if the product was using a wall that was required to have an FRL under the DTS provisions, would be required to determine that using Schedule 5. Now, the building element, which in this case is the external wall, would have to be identical to a tested prototype, or it could differ in a minor degree if we're subject to a report from an accredited testing lab. Now, this would mean we'd need specific evidence that's outside the code mark to confirm compliance. So in this specific case, to meet all the relevant performance requirements that would apply, we could only consider the code mark as meeting the aspects that's listed, obviously subject to it being within the limitations that's specified. And then we'd have to use other deemed to satisfy solutions or performance solutions to meet the other aspects of the code that are outside the scope of the certificate. So we commonly see code marks relied upon in building permit documentation. However, they rarely consider holistic compliance, and often evidence for other aspects of the code is missing. We've also received some comments around how a building surveyor isn't permitted to refuse to approve building work if it complies with the certificate of accreditation. This applies to BRAC certificates and code mark certificates. Now, in the situations that we're seeing in building auditing, often the building work doesn't comply with the accreditation. Either it's used outside the limitations, or there are other relevant provisions that aren't addressed in the certificate that aren't considered anywhere in the permit documentation. So it's really important for building surveyors to understand the limitations with the certificates and ensure they're used appropriately and not accepted in blind faith as satisfying every aspect of the code. Here's actually an example on the screen of the same product, which is a revised certificate. You'll notice straight away that it makes a lot more claims, and in this instance it makes direct claims against the performance requirements and some DTS provisions, and it's now expanded to section B and F compliance. Now, the certificate will still explain the limitations in terms of the compliance claims. However, this is obviously a more holistic example of considering all the relevant performance requirements that might apply to this specific product. If we're relying on this certificate to meet BP 1.1 and FP 1.4, for instance, we'd still need to check things like the maximum loads for the project don't exceed those that are specified. And in circumstances they do, the applicant will need to provide other types of evidence to confirm compliance. So although we've got this certificate of conformity, we still need to assess that the limitations in the certificate are appropriate for our specific project. Recently, we audited a project which had a performance solution for inconsistent risers in a flight, and it exceeded the inconsistent risers that are permitted by the DTS provision. So it exceeded what DTS permitted as a variation. Now, in this case, besides the building surveyor producing the performance solution and then issuing the building permit, it was approved on 4 dot points, which we've listed on the screen, and they were attempting to justify the proposal. So there wasn't anything more than a sentence justifying each aspect of the design, and it was looking at equivalence to deemed to satisfy. So the first part that was specified was slip resistance. Now, this is already required under the deemed to satisfy provisions, so it's not particularly relevant in the circumstance. There was an assumption being made that access was primarily by lifts, and this could be assumed on a deemed to satisfy compliant building as well. There was actually some ability to look at DP2, and we could have potentially considered the nature, volume and frequency of likely usage. However, we could make the same assumptions on a deemed to satisfy compliant building, so it's not entirely relevant as a justification point. There was a claim that the stairs had handrails. However, they're also required under the deemed to satisfy provisions. Now, if this was in a class 1 context, where the DTS only requires 1 handrail, there could have been the ability to establish what would happen if we considered the use of 2 handrails instead of 1. However, in this case, it was a commercial building and there was 2 required under DTS. There was also the 4th claim, which is that residents will become adjusted to the variation. Now, besides the fact that this would require repetitive use and what would happen if they fell down on the first time they used it, this was really where the ability to justify the claims of equivalence was possible, and it wasn't really recognised or documented in a way that it was sufficient. There was really potential to use expert judgment, and this could have gone into things like journal articles or similar that considered things like proprioception, which is the body's ability to sense its location and its movements and actions. And it could have really established whether this would have an impact in this particular situation. So we could have compared it against a deemed to satisfy compliant inconsistent risers and then done a comparison with DTS. We really need to stress the importance of a defendable justification for how performance solutions demonstrate compliance with the performance requirements. This isn't just for the VBA undertaking audit functions, because it is obviously easier for us when they're very well documented. However, it could apply to wider risks associated with civil claims surrounding negligence if something was to go wrong and someone was to be severely injured. Now, in this scenario, besides the building surveyor being involved in the designing of the building work, there wasn't a sufficient performance solution documented. And in situations like this, the quality of the documentation assists everyone in the process. So it really assists the building surveyor in making the compliance determination. It assists the builder in constructing the building work in a manner that will comply, and assist the owners in understanding any obligations on themselves. So if there's any maintenance obligations or any obligations on themselves, and then it ultimately assists the VBA in auditing compliance of the project. So really important that performance solutions are documented appropriately, and really a 4-point performance solution is probably never suitable. So certainly document them to a high degree. Obviously, the standard will depend on the specific situation. There might not be that much required for simple things, and more complicated things will require full reports. But certainly the level of documentation should be commensurate with the solution, and it should demonstrate compliance with the performance requirement. So that brings us to our question and answer session, which we're going to open up for. You use the Q&A function at the bottom. I think I can see things popping up, so I think people have already started using those, but we have around 17 minutes, and yeah, my understanding is we're going to publish any answers we don't get around to.
Terrific, thanks Matt. Thanks for your presentation. I suppose my experience to date, mainly through the recent cladding audits, has shown a number of examples of poorly justified performance solutions. There have also been a number of performance solutions that have been documented and approved by the RBS, so sort of against the provisions within the Act and regulations for an independent party to formulate those performance solutions. The ABCB is also providing future education for practitioners in relation to performance solutions later in the year, and they're looking at introducing more requirements in regards to documentation of performance solutions. So I'd encourage you to attend those as well when the dates are released. It's also critical for building surveyors to assess reports in support of a performance solution and form an opinion as to whether the report adequately justifies the performance solution as meeting the performance requirements. We've seen a number of permits that have not included design features that are nominated in the fire engineering report, or that do not meet the conditions that are included in the fire engineering report. So it's important for those steps to be taken by a building surveyor. So we might move into the questions. We've got a number of those, so hopefully we can get through some or most of them. There we go. So I've got one here. What is being done throughout the industry to educate other consultants, that is architects, builders, on what performance is? So that's a good question. I think probably shows a bit of frustration, I suspect, from building surveyors that we're one part of the chain. I think a lot of the feedback we got in regards to the draft code of conduct from other practitioners demonstrated the lack of understanding of the function and role of a building surveyor. So I think there is an expectation that the building surveyor formulates the performance solutions and is involved in the design process in some parts. And obviously that then puts pressure on building surveyors if there's that expectation. So there is a bit of work to be done to educate those other practitioners on what their role should be in that process, what role the building surveyor plays, and hopefully basically train them up to the point where they're able to, in some circumstances, document those performance solutions. So I think there is a role for architects in some instances to be able to document those. Obviously, we've got fire engineers that can document them, and there's potentially a greater role for building surveyors to be involved as a consultant rather than just in the RBS role. So you'd have that dual role in some instances for separate building surveyors. Got another question, re-waterproofing provisions. Would a performance solution be required for a brick veneer wall and a weatherboard external wall? It's probably a yes and no answer. With the volume 2, you've got acceptable construction manuals that cover some forms of external cladding. So you've got the masonry code as an acceptable construction manual, and you've got acceptable construction provisions within volume 2 as well that covers things like timber cladding, weatherboards, fibre cement, and those sort of products. So if you're following those provisions and approving it under that, under those requirements, then DTS would apply. The issue you have is with volume 1, with commercial buildings, that there's no acceptable construction manuals for weatherproofing for external cladding. So that then requires a performance solution. So I think that is a difficulty, I think, with the and a shortfall of the building code in that, and it's probably something that, as Matt sort of touched on, is something that's not necessarily happening in practice, that a lot of products are being accepted without running through a performance solution. And I think, from my viewpoint, I think that's something that should really be pushed back to the manufacturers, that the manufacturers of these products should be providing a documented performance solution, going through all the appropriate testing, and provide that as a standard. And I think the issue with performance solution, where we don't have standards, any of these new products require performance solutions to start with, but when they've been around for a number of years, they almost become standardised. And I think that's where we're at in regards to accepting a lot of the performance solutions, that these products have been accepted and built for a long time, but may not have been included in the standard, or for commercial not included in any performance provision. So it's definitely something we need to close the gap, because I think it's, from an administrative process, it's going to be fairly burdensome for a performance solution to have to be issued on multiple products. Another one, if RBS is not accepting not accepting of the acceptance criteria proposed, it is not usual to simply say, no, I will not accept the acceptance criteria, without elaboration on what would be acceptable. Please comment. So I think it's in relation to the conflict of interest and participating in the design. Definitely not an easy one where to draw the line. I think where we're sitting at the moment is that some level of input is definitely warranted, that we need that, because the process won't work. It'll sort of grind to a halt. So, but it's guidance of a routine and general nature. So it's basically elaborating on where you see the shortfalls in the justification of the performance solution, but not providing the actual full answer, if you like. And that's not as simple as it sounds either, because I think for simple situations, you're probably almost giving them the answer. For more complex situations, I think that's where you basically provide them some guidance, but they would then have to go away and fill in the gaps and provide that justification back. We're hoping to provide a bit more guidance and some examples on that issue later in the year with code of conduct sessions, with that being sort of one of the principles within the code of conduct. Can you advise if Vitricor G2 is compliant, albeit it has a code mark? There is word out in the streets that the VBA consider Vitricor G2 non-compliant. So basically, Vitricor G2, we probably shouldn't really comment on particular products, but I think it basically meets the C1.9E concessions for a laminar. So that particular clause lists a number of building products that are accepted, that although they won't pass the 1531 Part 1 test for a non-combustible material, they've been accepted by the BCA. And so my understanding is the current provisions for Vitricor meet that particular and I think there was some issues with that product where it was tested and some variability in the glue layer. So I think they've now been allayed that they've got their processes in place to ensure that that glue layer is meeting the provisions of that particular clause. What else have we got? I'm not sure whether you're ready, Matt, to answer any questions yet.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer some, Andrew. So there's one about the presentation seems to discourage the use of performance in an industry where the DTS of the BCA have not kept up with the times. Goes on to say about more education is needed throughout the industry. Definitely agree. Seems like as a building surveyor, if you accept a code mark under performance, you're still open for scrutiny, even though the Act does not allow you to refuse a code mark. Is it the VBA's goal to make surveyors go back to the BAB for approval for all designs which are not within DTS requirements? Certainly not the intention of the VBA on that one. In terms of the scrutiny that you'll get in terms of looking at a code mark, the section you're talking about, 15.2, it basically still requires it to be in accordance with the accreditation. So it has to actually be complying with the accreditation. It's the circumstances where it's outside the scope, which is a limitation clearly provided for in a certificate, or if it's something that wasn't considered and there was an assumption that it was compliant. So for instance, if it didn't have a compliance against CP1, for instance, and it was used in a wall that had an FRL or others, then that would be where you would have kind of fallen down in that process. So certainly not trying to discourage use of performance. It's just that it's complicated, and it's because it doesn't have that benchmark, and it's used for innovative products, like you say, because the BCA is too slow to keep up with how quickly things change in the industry.
Right, thanks, Matt. Got another one here. When are the VBA going to investigate suppliers and their claims about their products, including installation information provided on their websites, which do not correlate to their testing documents? So yeah, we acknowledge that as being an issue, something we're sort of looking at in conjunction with Consumer Affairs as well, because I think it's potentially some false advertising in some instances, and frustrating. I think it's this whole issue around accountability of the other players in the process too, that I think the manufacturers and suppliers currently don't have much skin in the game, and something definitely that I'd like to change. I'd like to see them being involved more throughout the process. So it's not only that they're testing their products and getting a certificate at the beginning, but they're basically moving on into the QA space, that there's some way of making sure that the products are being produced that meet that test requirement. Because I think there's some evidence there that they pass their test with a sample that's highly quality assured from their viewpoint. Then they move into their manufacturing, and sometimes things move over the years, and it's not necessarily the same product that was tested. So that needs to be addressed. And I'd love to actually see the manufacturers and suppliers responsible for installation as well, that now we're getting more and more complex systems and processes. It's getting harder for everyone else in the chain to ensure that they're built in accordance with the manufacturer's requirements and details. So I think there needs to be some responsibility on their part to either certify appropriate trades or supervise the work and sign off on it at the end. So that provides some more surety, and probably then means that they're paying more attention about whether products are being used in the right situations if they're signing off on it as well. Matt?
There's one, when accepting certificates of conformity, does a performance solution still need to be fully documented every time as per the suggested process? So that 4-step process, or is it just when there's a more holistic assessment needed? The answer to that is that process isn't necessarily coming in. If it does, then you'll have to document it using that process. So you'll have to do a brief, and that will basically say your assessment method is using a evidence of suitability, which is using a code mark certificate of conformity. That doesn't have to be very large, and in situations where a code mark's used, it's probably going to be extremely small, and it'll just be that you're relying on a code mark. as your evidence, and then going on from there. But there's a few questions around that actually, which is around, do they need to be documented and other things? And yeah, the determination still needs to be made as well, even for code marks. And it's because the legislation says any evidence of suitability the building surveyor relied upon for performance solutions. So that's knocked out a couple of questions, I think.
Thanks, Matt. Got another one. Clearly, there are serious issues regarding approval of performance solutions in this regard as an interim measure to protect owners, and until everyone gets the hang of this, should the government not be requiring all performance solutions to be approved through the Building Appeals Board? Yeah, so it's one that's been a discussion point at all levels of government, I think, and one that ABCB are looking at. So ABCB have got a team together that's looking at the Building Confidence Report, the Sheargold Weir report requirements, and trying to come up with some national provisions that can be applied in all states. They are looking at the requirements for peer review and introducing a concept of complex buildings, that for buildings that sort of fit a category where the risks are sort of potentially more, the expectation would be that you'd have to go to an independent third-party peer review for the performance solution, so that there's more rigour around it. It is concerning because I think the performance area is getting more and more complex with new materials, new innovations, and so that really relies on then the competence of the designers and then also the ability of the building surveyor to be able to assess that. And I think there's some other questions along that line as well around whether a building surveyor should be responsible for vetting, say, a fire engineering report, that the fire engineer's got that expertise. And so once again, that's where there needs to be a level of checking and a level of validation of the reporting and the provisions of the fire engineer. Unfortunately, if the building surveyor doesn't have the capabilities to review that and confirm it and feel comfortable with what's being proposed, then they probably do need to go back to the applicant and say, well, there's a peer report required to actually review it and confirm it. That's important. As a minimum, the building surveyor needs to go through and check what assumptions the fire engineering report's made, because I think that's been demonstrated that there was past fire engineering reports that have had conditions on there that, for instance, the fire ratings be upgraded. Well, that was never documented in the actual permit. So those sort of issues shouldn't be occurring.
There's a few about weatherproofing. So Jacob's asked one about, like to get to the point of weatherproofing. Did the VBA expect a secondary building surveyor or engineer on every single project to prepare a performance solution rather than the RBS having discretion? In respect to that, there's a verification method in the BCA that could be used, and there's also the code mark certificates can make claims of compliance against FP 1.4. The answer is you'd need to document a performance solution, and it should be done on every project unless you can justify that FP 1.4 is not applicable under the limitations. There was another one which was, why is there no DTS for that? And it kind of, the reason that there isn't is because I know that they're trying to look at bringing it in for some common construction, which is consistent with volume 1 and 2. So things like weatherboards and masonry and other things. The main reason is when you get into high rise and things, the systems are very proprietary in nature. So it's quite difficult to actually develop DTS provisions that encompass a wide variety of different types of appropriate fixings and other things. So that's essentially the reason.
All right, thanks, Matt. I'm just conscious of the time. I might answer one more question. There's some great questions here. So thank you very much for your participation. I just got one. Will there be any standard forms developed to document performance solution process? That's been discussed by us as well, that we think it might be worthwhile sort of considering that to assist with the building surveyors' inputs and getting some consistency across the board. So it might be one that we might have a discussion with some of the players within the industry to sort of see whether that's appropriate and what form that might take. So I think it's probably a good initiative. So on that note, I thank you all for attending this session. Please watch out for future sessions during the year, and any feedback is welcome on this and other sessions that you see might be of value in the future. Thank you for attending.